December 17th, 1944. Belgium. The Ardennes Forest. The temperature has dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The fog is so thick you can't even see the hood of your own Jeep. But there is only one thing here scarier than the cold. The silence. Suddenly, that silence is torn apart by a sound like an earthquake. Emerging from the morning mist is a steel monster weighing 70 tons. It is the King Tiger, the most terrifying tank of World War II. Behind it comes another, and another. Standing on the turret of the lead tank is a man in a black uniform, Joachim Peiper. He is only 29 years old, yet already a colonel. He is the face of the German Blitzkrieg, a darling of propaganda. His mission is simple: break through to the sea, slice the Allied armies in half, and change the course of history. Peiper looks confident. He shouts orders. His men are laughing, tasting victory. They have just crushed the American defenses like a paper cup. But if you could look inside this formidable tank, you would see the one thing that made Peiper sweat even in the freezing cold: the fuel gauge needle. It was trembling near zero. The most powerful armored armada in human history, Hitler's elite, the pride of the Third Reich, was going into battle with nearly empty tanks. They had a plan. A mad, daring, pirate-like plan. They intended to refuel on the move by stealing gasoline from the Americans. Imagine deciding to cross the Sahara with only a single bottle of water, hoping to rob a caravan along the way. And then, a few hours into the battle, a miracle happens. Peiper rolls into the town of Bulge. His scouts report, "We found it. Not gold, not secret documents. They found a depot of the U.S. Army's 644th Quartermaster Battalion." Peiper looks through his binoculars and cannot believe his eyes. Before him are mountains, endless rows of green jerry cans, 50,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. For a German colonel in 1944, this looks like a hallucination. In Germany, fuel is liquid gold. It is rationed by the drop. People kill for it. And here, at a standard field depot, the Americans have simply left it. SS soldiers jump off the armor. Chaos ensues. They grab the cans, pass them down the line, and pour the gasoline directly into the insatiable throats of their tigers. They laugh, slapping each other on the back. They shout, "Look, even their cans are better than ours." Peiper smiles too. He thinks this is his greatest tactical victory. He thinks he has just extended the life of his offensive by another 3 days. He thinks luck is on his side. But in that moment, standing amidst thousands of American cans, Joachim Peiper made the biggest mistake of his life. He was looking at the situation through the eyes of a soldier, not a logistician. He saw 50,000 gallons of salvation. But he failed to ask himself the most important question. A question that should have made him turn his tanks around and drive straight back to Germany immediately. The question was, if the Americans abandoned 50,000 gallons in this dirty little village and didn't even try to defend it, then how much of this stuff do they actually have? Peiper thought he had won the jackpot. In reality, he had just picked up some spare change that fell out of a giant's pocket. At that moment, as his soldiers greedily poured foreign fuel into their tanks, Peiper didn't yet know that this discovery wasn't salvation. It was a mockery. What was a miracle for an elite German division, a prize worth risking their lives for, was, for the American supply system, a rounding error, a statistical discrepancy. Peiper filled his tanks and ordered the advance toward the Meuse River, feeling like a predator that had just eaten a full meal. He didn't know that this lunch was just bait in a giant mousetrap, and the spring of that trap was already beginning to coil. To understand why this moment of triumph was actually the beginning of the end, we need to leave the snowy fields of Belgium. We need to transport ourselves to a bunker where, months earlier, a plan was born that was doomed to fail not by bullets, but by mathematics. Let's go back 3 months. September 16th, 1944. the Wolf's Lair. Hitler gathers his generals. He looks sick. His hand is trembling, but his eyes burn with fanatical fire. He unfolds a map and draws a thick red line through the Ardennes forest straight to the port city of Antwerp. The concept is grandiose. Gather all remaining forces. Strike where the Allies least expect it. Capture Antwerp, the main supply port for the Americans and British. The generals look at the map, then at each other. A heavy silence hangs in the room. No one argues about tactics. No one argues about the number of soldiers. Everyone is thinking about one word. A 5-letter word in German. Sprit. Fuel. By the autumn of 1944, Germany wasn't just losing the war. It was suffocating. American bombers were methodically, day after day, leveling synthetic fuel plants to the ground. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable air force, was grounded, not because there were no planes, but because pilots were forbidden to take off to save precious kerosene. And now, Hitler proposes throwing thousands of heavy tanks into battle. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an old Prussian officer, dares to ask a question. He points out that such an operation would require a minimum of 5 million gallons of fuel. Do you know how much the Reich had in reserve? Less than a third of that. The math didn't add up. Physics was against them. Any cadet at a military academy would have said the operation was impossible. But Hitler gives an answer that will go down in history books as an example of strategic madness. He says, "You don't need to bring fuel with you. You will take it from the Americans." Think about that. This isn't just a military plan. It's a bank robbery scenario where the robbers go in without bullets, hoping to snatch guns from the guards. German command created special fuel hunter units. Tank crews were issued maps not with enemy artillery positions, but with marked U.S. Army supply depots. They were told in plain text, "Your tanks are fueled just enough to reach the first American depot. If you don't capture it, you're walking." I found an archival document dated November 1944. It's a memo from a Panzer Division commander. It contains dry figures, but panic hides behind them. It reads, "Our reserves allow for 150 kilometers under combat conditions." The problem was that Antwerp was 300 kilometers away. They were starting the most important battle on the Western Front, knowing that, mathematically, they couldn't reach the finish line. It wasn't a battle. It was a gamble, an all-in bluff. The generals hoped for a miracle. They hoped for the fog of war. But most of all, they hoped that the famous American logistics would work against its creators, that the Americans would bring so many supplies that there would be enough even for the Germans. The irony is, they were right. The Americans did bring an ocean of fuel, but the German generals forgot one detail. To steal gasoline, you have to reach it. And they put their men not in light jeeps, but in the hungriest monsters the earth had ever seen. Let's talk about what exactly Joachim Peiper was driving to his defeat. The King Tiger. Tiger II. If you look at it in a museum or a video game, it is a masterpiece. Thick sloped armor that almost no Allied shell could penetrate. A long-barreled 88mm cannon capable of tearing the turret off a Sherman from 2 kilometers away. German engineers created the perfect dueling machine, but they forgot that a tank doesn't just shoot, it has to move. Under the hood of this steel Leviathan was a Maybach engine with 700 horsepower. Sounds impressive. In reality, this engine barely coped with the 70-ton carcass. To move the Tiger, the engine had to run at its limit. Always. Now, imagine the Ardennes. Narrow roads winding between hills. Deep snow. Mud that sucks boots down to the knee. In these conditions, the Tiger turned from a predator into a junkie requiring a fix every minute. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. On the highway, the Tiger consumed about 500 liters per 100 kilometers. But in the Ardennes mud, that figure doubled. Let's translate this into understandable terms. An American Sherman tank could travel about half a mile to a mile on 1 gallon of fuel. Not great, but manageable. A King Tiger in combat conditions in the Ardennes ate 3, 4, sometimes 5 gallons for 1 mile. Imagine driving a car where every 300 meters you have to stop and pour in a full jerry can of gas just to go another 300 meters. It was a logistical nightmare. Peiper's column stretched for 25 kilometers. And it wasn't just tanks. There were fuel trucks. But here's the paradox. The fuel trucks also consumed fuel to carry fuel. The deeper they advanced into Belgium, the more absurd the math became. To deliver 1 liter of gasoline to Peiper's lead tank, the rear services burned 2 liters on delivery. German mechanics prayed to their machines, but cursed their appetite. Every time Peiper ordered "forward," he heard not the roar of engines, but the sound of precious synthetic fuel draining from the tanks. They created a weapon that was too perfect for the real world. While Americans stamped out thousands of simple, reliable, and crucially, economical trucks and tanks, the Germans bet on artisanal pieces that required ideal conditions. But war isn't a laboratory. War is chaos. And while Peiper's Tigers roared and spun their tracks in the Belgian mud, sucking the last juices out of the Reich, something opposite was happening on the other side of the front. There was no wonder weapon there. There were no genius tank aces. Instead, there was an endless, boring, but relentless river. A river made of trucks, rubber, and gasoline. While Peiper counted every liter behind the front lines, something was happening that violated all laws of military economics. The Americans built a conveyor belt, hundreds of miles long. It was called the Red Ball Express. After landing in Normandy, the Allies advanced so fast they outran their supply ports. Railways were bombed out, often by the Allies themselves before the landing. Pipelines didn't exist yet. The only way to feed a 1,000,000-man army rushing toward the German border was trucks. Lots of trucks. U.S. command did what it did best. They turned a problem into an industrial project. They took 2 parallel roads leading from the coast of France to the front. They made them one-way streets. One road, only east to the front. The second, only west, back for cargo. No civilian traffic, no stops, no restrictions. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Along these roads flowed an unending stream of 6,000 trucks. GM CCCKWs, the famous Jimmies, or the Deuce and a Half. Behind the wheels of these machines sat men rarely written about in tactical books. 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American. At that time, the U.S. Army was still segregated. These guys weren't trusted with rifles on the front line, but they were entrusted with the circulatory system of the entire war, and they performed a feat equal to any combat operation. Official statistics say the convoy was supposed to move at 25 miles per hour with a 60-yard distance. In reality, it was a race for survival. Mechanics ripped the speed governors off the engines. Trucks flew at 50 to 60 miles per hour, overloaded by double. Drivers didn't sleep for days. One veteran recalled, "We drove until we started seeing devils on the road. Then we'd stop, wash our faces with ice water, drink black coffee, and hit the gas again." It was a feat of human endurance multiplied by American abundance. Every day, this steel stream delivered 12,500 tons of supplies to the front. Every single day. Among these cargoes were shells, food, winter clothes. But the main cargo was gasoline. Millions of cans. And here lies the most shocking detail for any German logistician. The Red Ball Express system was monstrously inefficient. To deliver cargo to the front, trucks burned hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel. Often, they burned more than they delivered. Tires were ground to dust in a week. Engines exploded from overheating. Trucks were simply pushed into ditches, and new ones were taken. Germans, seeing such resource consumption, would have called it a crime, a catastrophe. But for Americans, it was just the cost of doing business. The U.S. had so much oil, so much rubber, and so much steel that they could afford to be inefficient. They didn't need to save. They needed to be fast. The Germans fought by the textbook, where every drop counts. The Americans fought as if resources were infinite. For Peiper and his men, the sight of a knocked-out American tank was a joy. But they didn't understand the main point. For every knocked-out Sherman, Detroit had already produced 2 new ones. For every burned jerry can, Texas had already pumped a barrel of oil. It was not a war of soldiers. It was a war of systems. And the German system, built on scarcity and heroism, collided with the American system, built on surplus and logistics. Hunger. It was the constant companion of the German soldier by the end of 1944. Not just a desire for a snack, but a deep, visceral hunger. The Wehrmacht's ration by this time consisted of so-called ersatz products. Bread bulked up with sawdust, margarine made from coal, coffee that had never seen a coffee bean, just roasted barley or acorns. Peiper's soldiers, despite their elite status, were no exception. They fought on empty stomachs, keeping warm with schnapps and methamphetamine. Goebbels' propaganda told them, Americans are weak. They don't know how to fight. Their supply lines are cut by our heroic U-boats. And the German soldiers believed it, until they captured the first American positions. Among the corpses and abandoned weapons, they started finding rations. It was like stepping into another world. Instead of paper bags with rusks, they found tin cans with stew, real beef. They found Lucky Strike cigarettes, packets of Maxwell House instant coffee, Hershey's chocolate bars. But there was one specific incident described by many veterans that became a legend. The moment when the war ended for them, psychologically. A group of German soldiers was searching a captured American Jeep. On the back seat, they found a mail package. It was addressed to a private from Boston, or maybe Cincinnati. They opened the box with a bayonet. Inside was a chocolate cake. Fresh. Homemade. Chocolate cake. Try to comprehend this from the perspective of a German infantryman sitting in a dirty hole in Belgium. In Germany, in Berlin itself, sugar is impossible to get. Flour is rationed. Chocolate is a memory from pre-war childhood. And here, on the front line, thousands of miles from America, a simple private receives fresh pastries by mail from mom. This meant only one thing. American logistics were so powerful, so all-encompassing, that they could afford to ship not just shells and tanks across the ocean. They shipped cakes. They shipped Christmas turkeys, Coca-Cola in glass bottles, fresh socks. For the Germans, this was scarier than carpet bombing. If the enemy can deliver a pie across the Atlantic, across France, straight into a trench under fire, how can you defeat such an enemy? This discovery broke their will harder than the fear of death. SS soldiers ate this trophy chocolate with bitterness, because every bite reminded them, we are beggars. We are fighting against rich men. Peiper saw how his men's faces changed. The fanatical shine disappeared. Tired envy appeared. They realized that even if they killed every American in this forest, new ones would take their place. Well-fed, dressed in warm parkas, with pockets full of cigarettes. While at home, in Germany, only ruins and ersatz bread awaited them. But cake is just insulting. What awaited Peiper next was deadly. Ahead, on Peiper's maps, the town of Stavelot was marked, and there lay something more important than any cake. Fuel. Lots of fuel. Peiper rushed there, hoping luck would smile on him again, as it had in Bullingen. But this time, the Americans prepared a warm welcome for him. Literally. December 18th, 1944. The outskirts of Stavelot. The situation for Peiper is becoming critical. His tanks are no longer running on gasoline. They are running on fumes. Mechanics are wringing the last drops from reserve cans. Peiper knows. Just beyond Stavelot lies the road to Spa, and along this road lies the largest fuel depot in Europe. 2.5 million gallons. This isn't just a gas station. It is an ocean of energy that can carry his tanks not just to Antwerp, but to the English Channel itself. Standing between Peiper and this ocean is only a handful of American engineers and infantrymen commanded by Major Paul Solis. Solis realizes he cannot hold the position. Facing him are King Tigers. He has rifles and a few bazookas. The Major has two options. Try to evacuate the fuel, which is impossible. He needs hundreds of trucks he doesn't have. Or leave it for the Germans. But there is a third option. An option that contradicts the instinct of any normal human being. Destruction. Imagine this moment. You are a quartermaster. Your job is to store and issue supplies. You know the price of every can. You know how much labor it took to get this gasoline from Texas to Belgium. And now, you must burn it all with your own hands. Solis gives the order. Soldiers build a barricade of jerry cans. They open the caps. Gasoline pours onto the road, mixing with mud and snow. The smell is dizzying. In the distance, the clank of German tank tracks is already audible. Peiper is close. He smells the gasoline. To him, it is the smell of victory. And in that moment, Major Solis strikes a match. What happened next, the Germans described as Dante's Inferno. It wasn't just a bonfire. It was a wall of fire, 30 meters high. A massive river of fire flowed down the road toward the German tanks. 124,000 gallons of gasoline ignited simultaneously. When Peiper's lead tank came around the bend, it didn't hit anti-tank hedgehogs, but a solid wall of flame. Peiper was a fearless commander. He could order his tanks to charge machine guns. He could walk under artillery fire. But you can't cheat physics. A tank cannot drive through fire of such intensity. The engine will choke without oxygen. The ammunition will detonate from the heat. The crew will boil alive inside the steel box. Peiper watched this fire through a vision slit. He watched the fuel that could have saved his army burn. In that fire, it wasn't just hydrocarbons burning. Millions of Reichsmarks spent on this operation were burning. Hitler's last hope was burning. But the scariest thing for Peiper wasn't that. The scariest thing was the ease with which the Americans did it. They burned $1 million worth of fuel without batting an eye, just to delay him for a couple of hours. For Germany, the loss of such a depot would have been a national tragedy. Courts, executions, a search for the guilty. For the Americans, it was just a line in a report. Assets written off to prevent enemy capture. Peiper, standing before this wall of fire, finally truly realized the scale of the catastrophe. He was fighting against a system that could afford to burn resources that Germans killed for. He turned the tanks around. There was nowhere to go forward. The tanks were dry. Operation Watch on the Rhine didn't die in battle with other tanks. It died here, staring at a bonfire of American abundance. While Joachim Peiper stared at the burning gasoline in Stavelot, 5,000 miles away, in the town of Kilgore, Texas, something completely different was happening. There were no gunshots. There was only the rhythmic, monotonous clanking. The clanking of thousands of oil pump jacks. If you look at photos of East Texas in the 1940s, it looks like a forest. But instead of trees, there are steel derricks. They were packed so tightly, you could jump from one platform to another without touching the ground. This is where Germany lost the war. Not in Stalingrad, not in Normandy, and not in the Ardennes. She lost it here, in the oil fields of America. Let's look at the numbers. They don't lie. In 1944, the United States produced over 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany, using all its resources, occupied territories in Romania, and its famous synthetic fuel plants managed to scrape together 33 million. 1.8 billion versus 33 million. This isn't even David versus Goliath. It's an ant versus an elephant. The state of Texas alone produced more oil than all the Axis powers combined. Germany tried to cheat nature. German chemists, undeniably geniuses, invented the coal hydrogenation process to turn rocks into gasoline. But this process was slow, expensive, and required massive factories that were perfect targets for bombers. America didn't need to be genius. It just needed to punch holes in the ground. This difference in scale created absurd situations at the front. The American army consumed fuel with a wastefulness that stunned German prisoners. Americans used gasoline to heat water for shaving. They didn't turn off Jeep engines at stops so the cabin would stay warm. Germany, at the same time, issued instructions on how to harness oxen to trucks to save diesel. But the deadliest blow of this math was in the sky. To fly, planes need high-octane gasoline. Aviation fuel is the blood of air warfare. The U.S. produced it in such quantities that American pilots logged hundreds of training hours before seeing the front. German aces in 1944 were sent into battle with barely a couple of hours of real flight time. Why? Because a training flight is a waste of resource. When Peiper planned his dash to the sea, he counted on capturing 2 to 3 million gallons of fuel. For him, this was the salvation of the entire campaign. Do you know how much that was for the U.S.? That was the daily consumption of General Patton's Third Army alone. What the entire SS elite hunted for was, for American logistics, just a Friday delivery. Peiper thought capturing the depot would change the course of the war. But the truth was, even if he drank that depot dry, it would change nothing. Behind that depot was another, and another, and another. The oceanic conveyor belt of Liberty tankers worked without stopping. Peiper was trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve, the village of La Glaise. For Joachim Peiper and his 800 soldiers, the war had stopped. Literally. The fuel gauge needles on all surviving vehicles dropped to 0. The formidable Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the German spear, was trapped. They were surrounded by Americans, cut off from supply, and immobilized. Around them stood King Tigers and Panthers, the pinnacle of German engineering. Machines that cost millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours. Their armor was intact. Their guns were loaded. The crews were ready to fight. But without gasoline, this 70-ton tank turns into a steel coffin. Without movement, it is simply an excellent target for artillery. Peiper makes a decision that sounds like sacrilege to any tanker. He orders the vehicles abandoned. Imagine this moment. You are the elite of the tank corps. Your tank is your home, your fortress, your life, and you just get out of it? They couldn't even blow up all the tanks. They didn't have enough explosives. They just opened the hatches, took maps, chocolate, letters from home, and jumped into the snow. Peiper gathered his officers in the basement of a house. His words that evening were dry and terrible. He said, "Take personal items. Take weapons you can carry. The rest is garbage. We are walking." Think about that word. Garbage. He called the best tanks in the world garbage. Because in a world ruled by logistics, the value of a thing is determined not by its firepower, but by the fuel in the tank. A Ferrari without gas is worth less than a bicycle. At 2 a.m., 800 men began their march. They walked quietly, trying not to rattle their mess tins. They slipped between the positions of American sentries. It was no longer a blitzkrieg. It was a march of ghosts. Soldiers whom propaganda called supermen waded through frozen streams, waist deep in icy water. They climbed the steep slopes of the Ardennes, clinging to tree roots. Looking back into the darkness, they knew they were leaving behind a graveyard of technology. When American troops entered L'Église the next morning, they couldn't believe their eyes. 135 armored vehicles stood on the streets. Pristine Tigers, trucks, APCs. It looked like the crews had just stepped out for lunch and would be right back. American mechanics walked up to the tanks, hit the starter button. The engine sputtered and died. They poured in a jerry can of their own gasoline, and the German monster roared to life. The Americans received a whole tank museum as a gift, simply because the previous owners ran out of food for these beasts. For Peiper, this foot march became a symbol of the collapse of Nazi ideology. Ideology said, "Will and spirit conquer all." Reality answered, "Will does not replace octane rating." They walked to their positions for 2 days. Not all of the 800 men made it, but those who did were broken. Not physically. They were tough guys. They were broken morally. They saw the future. And in that future, there was no place for them. They realized they were fighting against a civilization that could afford not to count resources. When Peiper finally reached the German headquarters, he looked less like a hero and more like a vagrant. Dirty, frostbitten, with empty eyes. He was asked about the state of his division, about his invincible tanks. He just waved his hand toward the west, where millions of dollars of the German military budget were left rusting in the snow. Those King Tigers, rusting in the snow, became more than just a monument to Germany's defeat. They became the foundation for how America wages war today. Military analysts call it the tooth-to-tail ratio. The teeth are the soldiers who shoot and the tanks that attack. The tail is logistics, cooks, mechanics, truck drivers. Germany bet on the sharpest teeth in the world, but it had an atrophied, weak tail. And when the tail stopped supplying nutrients, the teeth fell out. America drew conclusions. If you look at the U.S. Army today, you see the direct heir of that chocolate cake and the infinite jerry cans. During World War II, while the Japanese and Germans taught their soldiers to die for the Emperor or the Führer, the U.S. Navy designated a special barge in the Pacific Ocean. Do you know for what? It was a floating ice cream factory. It produced 500 gallons of ice cream every shift. Think about the absurdity of this fact. The most brutal war in history is raging. People are dying by the thousands. And the U.S. Navy is spending millions of dollars, fuel, and steel so that a sailor in the middle of the ocean can have a vanilla dessert. Nazi strategists laughed at this. They called Americans soft. They said such an army wouldn't be able to fight when things got tough. But they missed the main point. The ice cream barge isn't about comfort. It's about a demonstration of power. It is a message to the enemy. We are so rich, our resources are so limitless, that we can bring a dessert factory to the front line, and you can't even find rice or bread. This is psychological domination through logistics. Joachim Peiper in the Ardennes faced exactly this. He realized he was fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 grow back. Burn 1 depot. Tomorrow they build 3 new ones and bring hot coffee too. This legacy lives on today. When the U.S. Army deploys bases in Iraq or Afghanistan, the first things they build after walls are dining halls with steaks, gyms, and yes, sometimes even a Burger King. Critics say it's a waste of money. Historians say it's the lesson of the Ardennes. You cannot let a soldier feel cut off from home. You cannot give the enemy hope that you will run out of supplies. Victory in the Battle of the Bulge proved that boring guys with calculators and invoices are just as important as paratroopers with rifles. Perhaps even more important. History loves vivid images. We remember General Patton with his revolvers. We remember charismatic villains like Peiper in their stylish uniforms. We look at King Tigers in museums and admire their power. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that war is a duel of characters, a battle of tactics and technologies. But the story of Joachim Peiper in the Ardennes teaches us a different, less romantic, but far more important truth. Wars are not won by those with cooler tanks, and not by those with braver soldiers. Wars are won by those who know how to count. Joachim Peiper was, perhaps, the best commander of his time. His men were fanatically dedicated. Their equipment was 10 years ahead of its time, and all of this turned out to be absolutely useless in the face of a boring, dirty, and unheroic cargo manifest. Peiper was not defeated by an American tanker in a fair duel. He was defeated by a truck driver from Detroit who didn't sleep for 30 hours to deliver gasoline. He was defeated by an oil rig worker in Texas. He was defeated by a clerk who correctly filled out a purchase order for winter jackets. We often speak of the arsenal of democracy, but we rarely think about what that actually means. It means that while Germany sought a wonder weapon, America created a wonder system. A system that turned war into an industrial process where the opponent simply has no chance of survival because he will be buried in metal, flooded with oil, and crushed by rubber. The scene of elite SS soldiers walking past their functional but empty tanks is the most powerful image of World War II. It is a monument to arrogance, a reminder that ideology is powerless before physics. Germany thought it was fighting for living space. But on that frosty morning in Belgium, they realized they were actually fighting against multiplication tables. And that is a battle impossible to win. So the next time you see a movie hero saving the world alone, remember Major Solis, who simply struck a match. Remember Peiper staring at an empty fuel gauge. And remember, amateurs study tactics. Amateurs argue about whose tank is better. Professionals study logistics, because the most terrifying sound to an enemy isn't the whistle of an incoming bomb. It is the sound of a truck engine bringing another endless shipment of supplies to the front. And as long as that engine is running, the war is already won.